So without further ado, I'll segue now to our next speaker, and I will do so by giving a little more context of the link between Columbia and the Greater Bay Area, possibly not known to Professor Stern, but our Dean of Education, Professor Lynn Goodwin, is from Teachers College and probably will go back there, so we've decided to move on from Hong Kong. And I would say that the expertise that Professor Goodwin has brought to our faculty to highlight the importance of education, both in our faculty as well as in Hong Kong more generally, has definitely contributed to the appreciation in the Greater Bay Area of the reserve that we can focus on within our own practices at schools and also at the university. So without further ado, I will pass on to a fellow Columbia colleague and ask Professor Stern to take the platform, and Maria to introduce Professor Stern formally and begin his presentation.
Hello, good morning and good evening again. Okay, I will introduce Professor Yaakov Stern. Professor Yaakov Stern is the Florence Irving Professor of Neuropsychology in the Departments of Neurology, Psychiatry, and Psychology, and the Taub University Institute for the Research on Alzheimer's Disease and the Aging Brain at Columbia University, Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. He directs the Cognitive Neuroscience Division of the Department of Neurology. Dr. Stern's research focuses on cognition in normal aging and in diseases of aging, particularly Alzheimer's disease. A strong theme in his research is exploring individual differences in task performance in general, and more specifically, the reason why some individuals show more cognitive deficits than others in the face of brain insult. He directs the Reference Ability Neural Network Study, a large-scale longitudinal study designed to isolate brain activation and morphological features associated with specific cognitive abilities. He directs ongoing studies of cognition in normal age, heterogeneity of Alzheimer's disease, and epidemiological studies of cognitive aging and dementia. His research approach includes classic neuropsychological and cognitive experimental techniques with a strong focus on functional imaging. He has published over 600 peer-reviewed papers, numerous chapters, and edits a book on cognitive reserve. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I will share my your presentation now.
Okay, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'll be glad to ask questions, and I'm looking forward to see what I recorded. Hello, everyone. I'm Yaakov Stern. Thank you so much for asking me to take part in this meeting. I wish I could be there with you in person. So today I'm going to talk about the concepts of reserve and resilience across the lifespan. The basic idea behind reserve it's based on a standard clinical observation that one person can tolerate more brain damage than another. So one person can have the same size stroke as another, and one person can look worse than the other. What we'll talk about a lot today are some people can tolerate more age-related changes or more disease pathology than the others before they show cognitive changes. So you might say that reserve moderates the effects of brain damage on clinical outcomes. I'll talk about three concepts today: brain reserve, brain maintenance, and cognitive reserve. And let's just jump right into it and start with brain reserve, which was really the earliest concept that I'm aware of. It was put forth by Kassman and colleagues quite a while ago. They were following elders in the Bronx, which is in New York City, but north of Manhattan, where I work. And I work in the northern tip of Manhattan. And they were starting to get postmortem brains of the people that they were following. And in this paper, they described 10 women who were cognitively normal at death, but had a large degree of plaque pathology at postmortem. And they were quite surprised. The literature was just emerging, showing this correlation between amyloid plaque and cognition. And here were 10 women who did not show that correlation. And what they noted was that these women had larger brains than average. And they speculated that these individuals started with larger brains and more large neurons, and thus might be said to have a greater reserve. So what they were talking about is because they had more to lose, they could tolerate more pathology. And so that's the idea of brain reserve, more neurobiological capital. Here's a very simple example of brain reserve, but there are many papers like this. Peter Schofield was a postdoc in my group when this concept was just coming forward. We were in the midst of a study in North Manhattan following elders in the community. And Peter convinced the research assistants to put a tape measure around every subject's head. And so here we have smallest to largest head circumference and percent of people with Alzheimer's or prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. And you can see that the larger the head size, the lower the prevalence of dementia, of Alzheimer's disease. And this has been replicated using brain size, not just head circumference, in many, many studies. So that's brain reserve. Another concept, which is really the most recent concept, but just follows logically here, is this concept of brain maintenance. It was put forth by Nieberg et al. Here's sort of the key paper where they described it very well. The basic point that they are making is that there are individual differences in the degree of age-related brain changes or pathology, and that the relative lack of brain changes in pathology is the biggest contributor to heterogeneity of cognitive aging. So what they're saying is it's not a function of who can cope with brain changes better, but that some people don't have as many brain changes as others. And I think in the context of cognitive aging, not the disease, but normal cognitive aging, that's a very important point. You might say that the amount of brain maintenance that people have at any point in time might be their brain reserve. It's also important to note that a lot of the exposures that I'm going to talk about, and you'll hear about in this meeting, that have to do with maintaining brain, that have to do with maintaining reserve, giving resilience, also can play a role in maintaining brain integrity. So environmental exposures, lifestyle choices, genetic exposures, all can contribute to brain maintenance. So I consider brain maintenance a very important concept and sort of the flip side of cognitive reserve. Here's a early example. Michael Valenzuela and colleagues in Australia, they were following elders over time and looking at hippocampal volume. And each subject got this life experiences questionnaire, which talks about cognitively stimulating activities from childhood through later life. And they found that the people with higher scores on this questionnaire showed less decline in the size of their hippocampus than people who had lower LAQs. So somehow those with more stimulating activities showed less loss of brain size, which is a brain maintenance story, not a cognitive reserve story. Even more surprising to me at the time was this paper by Landau et al. They were, as I do, they were looking at healthy elders and imaging them in various studies. And one of the types of imaging that they gave was this PIB, which measures uptake into the brain of the tracer labeling amyloid. And they found that people with greater past activities, cognitively stimulating activities during midlife, had less PIB uptake. So here you go. You have here's less amyloid in their brain to greater activity, more amyloid to their brain to less activity. So it was the first time that I began thinking about the fact that maybe brain maintenance concept stretches to developing pathologies, not just head circumference or cortical thickness, but key pathologies as well. So it's a very powerful concept. Then comes the concept of cognitive reserve. The point I want to make here is that I would consider cognitive reserve an active model of reserve, whereas brain reserve is a passive model. Here's a figure that Satz published to look at this concept that he called threshold. He posited people with 2 degrees, different amounts of brain reserve he called it brain reserve capacity because he was extending it to more than what I'm talking about. But let's just talk about one person with more brain reserve than the other, bigger brain, more neurons. And what he said is, okay, if each of these two people get the same size lesion, this person will surpass some functional impairment cutoff and start to show cognitive changes, whereas this person will not. I call that a passive concept in that all we're talking about is the size of the lesion and the amount of the capacity, but we're not paying attention to the brain trying to cope with that lesion. As soon as someone surpasses this threshold, they start to show deficit. So in contrast, I adapted this figure and I said, okay, now let's take two people with the exact same amount of brain reserve capacity, but we could have this person who could tolerate a much larger lesion than this one before they start to show functional impairment. And that's because of what the brain is doing to actively cope with that lesion. So this person can deal with more brain damage than this one before they show pathology. Here's the first paper I published on cognitive reserve, although I did not use the term in that paper. And my friends make fun of me because I show it in every talk that I give. What I was thinking about this concept of cognitive reserve is that if you have two people who look the same clinically, two people with Alzheimer's disease, let's say, who look the same clinically, but one has much more education than the other. If we looked into their brain, let's say they came to postmortem, we might predict that the person with higher education is going to have more plaques and tangles in their brain than the person with lower education because they could tolerate more pathology before they get demented. But I didn't have the pathologic data to look at that. These big pathology studies weren't being done yet, but I knew about what we now call neurodegeneration. So I think this term is more common now. I'll show you these curves later, but if you the key ideas now underlying pathology in Alzheimer's is people might start out developing plaques, then tangles. Then they have this neurodegeneration, which can be measured with FDG PET or with volume loss. And after that, that neurodegeneration then leads to the cognitive changes that we see. So I knew at the time that we could look at this neurodegeneration, which is a function of the underlying pathology, using blood flow measures. Here we were using something called Z9. So here in this early study, I have 20, 20, and 20 patients with Alzheimer's disease. These three groups are carefully matched for disease severity, above high school education, high school graduate, below high school education. And you can see in this temporoparietal area that the higher the education, the more depleted the flow, as if these people are walking around with much more pathology than these, even though they look the same clinically. So controlling for clinical disease severity, there's an inverse relationship between education and neurodegeneration. Now, I like to show this because I was thrilled when I got the result. I still remember the excitement, but also because I think it incorporates three key components for studying cognitive reserve. If you study cognitive reserve, you have to think about three things: the pathology or the brain change that's responsible for the clinical outcome. So we're thinking that, okay, there's some brain change, age-related, or some disease pathology that's causing brain change, and that somehow there's a moderator of this relationship. In this case, it's education. So if you want to study reserve, you really have to think about, well, how is some exposure, experience, gene modifying the relationship between brain changes and the clinical outcome? Here's another early study. This is a study that we did in North Manhattan. We were following, as I mentioned before, normal elders, and it was still controversial whether education had anything to do with differential expression of Alzheimer's disease. So we had the opportunity to start with people who were not demented, follow them over time, and look to see whether education or occupational attainment influenced risk of developing Alzheimer's. So you see we had about 500 people. When we looked at low versus high education, the people with lower education had twice the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease over the follow-up period. Similarly, for occupational attainment, those with lower occupational attainment had about twice the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And if you combine occupation and occupation in reference to those who had high occupational and educational attainment, the lowest ones had the highest risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So my interpretation of those findings at that point was I didn't even think in any way that there could be a difference between these low and high education people in terms of their aggregation of AD pathology. So I assumed that they were all aggregating AD pathology at the same rate, but my explanation was that they were the people with higher education or higher occupational attainment could tolerate that pathology longer, and thus had to take longer until they developed Alzheimer's disease. They could tolerate more pathology, so it would take longer for them to develop Alzheimer's disease. This is one of the earliest meta-analyses of these kinds of incidence studies. Here's education, those using education, occupational attainment, premorbid IQ, and leisure activities. And anywhere where the confidence interval does not cross 1, a protective effect was found. So I just want to show you, here's the first 4 studies. This early study showed a protective effect. Then there were 2 studies on education that did not. And then this is, if you can see those little letters, that's our study where we showed a protective effect. And I have to say, I can still remember standing in front of a poster at the Academy of Neurology and friends coming over and looking at these data and snickering. The idea that something like education, this soft concept, could in some way influence this horrible disease seemed very strange to people, sort of like crystals. And it was only after many, many more studies were accrued that people started to take the idea seriously. Now it's hard to describe it because I think we're so used to that concept. Everyone walks around, use it or lose it, and this and that. But at that point, it was not well accepted. And just to show you again that I showed you some data for education and occupation, but people did studies with premorbid IQ and leisure activities as well. The other thing that we noted that I think is important is that higher reserve is associated with differential rates of decline in people who already have Alzheimer's disease. Let's just look at this figure. Here's advancing AD pathology, and here's memory test. If you agree or at least follow what I've been saying up until now, the people with higher reserve will need more pathology before they start to show a perturbation of their memory, whereas the people with lower reserve will have an earlier change in their memory. The other thing that we include here is a common endpoint. And the reason that I do that is that no matter how brilliant you are, you could be a Nobel Prize winner. If you have a lot of Alzheimer's pathology, you are going to be totally disabled. It's just a horrible disease. By the end, you can't talk, you can't walk, you can't eat. So given all those assumptions, after you start to develop the cognitive changes, the people with higher reserve actually decline more rapidly than the people with lower reserve. And that was a bit surprising to us. Yeah, here's our first paper. These are people with Alzheimer's disease matched at baseline for severity or their performance on a selective reminding test, a memory test. And you can see that the people with lower education are having a slower decline than the people with higher education. This is a nice replication of this a little later by Charlie Hall up in Einstein, the exact same studies in the Bronx that Katzman was part of. And what they have here is, again, the same Buschke selective reminding test, this memory test. And each one of these spaghetti plots is one person that was followed until here where they became demented. So this is 15 years before dementia, until dementia. And Charlie did a change point analysis. Let me see if I can point it out to you. So these people in the dark blue have the least education. You see here, this is a summary of all those spaghetti plots, and you see here's their change point, and here's their decline towards dementia, whereas the people with the highest education, their change point is much later with a more rapid decline. So it's just an important feature of cognitive reserve. Take a little break and just try to make a very important point. So we have these two concepts, cognitive reserve and brain maintenance. Brain maintenance, how well you maintain the brain. Cognitive reserve, once the brain starts to change, how well can you cope with that? And as I say, I think they're two sides of a coin and both very important measures. So here's a paper by my colleague Chris Habeck, where we took a lot of people and we estimated their cognitive reserve and their brain maintenance with a measure, residual measures. I'm not going to get into the details of how we did that estimation. And here's brain maintenance. And as you can see, brain maintenance correlates with IQ and with education. Here's cognitive reserve. You can see that cognitive reserve correlates with IQ and education. So both are influenced, as I said earlier, by many of the same features. Key point, there is really no relationship between individuals' cognitive reserve and their brain maintenance. They're two separate things, and not necessarily the person who has greater brain maintenance might not have better cognitive reserve, and vice versa. They could be influenced by the same exposures, but in different ways. And I think that's just a very important thing to keep in mind. Okay. Back to the very early findings regarding cognitive reserve. So the next thing we were thinking about is, well, what about in normal aging? Do people with higher education do better than people with lower education? So this is, I think, one of the earliest papers. Is Jennifer Manley. She was my postdoc at the time. And instead of using education, she used literacy. That was based on her, I think, a key observation that literacy is a much better measure of quality of education than just years. And what we found here, again, the same memory test score, is that the people with higher literacy showed a less rapid decline in their memory than the people with lower literacy. Now, this has been replicated sometimes, other times not replicated. We've replicated it in sort of the same population with many, many more people. Other people have, but quite a few studies have not shown differential rates of decline with as a function of in normal cognitive aging as a function of education. But as I'll show you in a second, there are other variables that are still associated with differential rates of decline in normal aging. So jump to a new paper. It's in medRxiv now, but it's under review in not just an archival journal, a pre-pub journal. This is based on a new study that we're working on, where we have several hundred people being followed for 5 years, and we're giving them tasks in 3 cognitive domains: perceptual speed, episodic memory, vocabulary, and fluid reasoning. We're giving them 3 tasks in the scanner and 3 tasks out of the scanner. And so what we could do here is, for each domain, like this is speed, we can create a latent variable that summarizes the 6 speed tasks at baseline, at follow-up, and then we can look at change between baseline and follow-up of those latent variables. Here's sort of a summary of 5-year trend for a little bit over 200 people here. And you can see each one of these lines is those scores 5 years apart. You can see the general trend for reasoning to get worse with aging, speed to get worse, memory to get worse. And these red lines are sort of inflection points where that decline speeds up a little more. Interestingly, vocabulary, which is a crystallized form of cognition, actually increases over the lifespan, and maybe the increase stops about here at age 67. A lot of people who study people from, like in our case, we started with people 20 through 80. At baseline, we found that the older people had better vocabularies than the younger people. And that could be a cohort effect, differences in school. It could be a recruitment bias, where because we need cognitively normal people, only people with older people with higher IQ can even meet criteria. But I think what really happens is that we acquire that semantic knowledge over time. And here you sort of see it happening. Each one of these lines is going up. And then by, about 70, we have it. Here's the key observation I wanted to show you. Over here, we have change from baseline. So 0 point is no change. And the lower you go from there, the more change, the less change. And this is estimated IQ using the NART, a word reading task. And you can see for reasoning and for memory, the higher the IQ, the less change in cognition over time. So the people here are perhaps getting slightly better, or at least not changing, and the people with lower IQ are not. Same thing for memory. We're getting this trend that with higher IQ, there's less change over time. Not the case for speed of processing. Now, I would want to make the claim that that's cognitive reserve, that the people with higher cognitive reserve show less cognitive change over time. And remember, now we're talking not just about people in their 70s, we're talking about people 20 through 80 to 25 through 85. But in order to make a cognitive reserve claim, we have to take one more step. So what we did is we had measures of brain structure like cortical thickness, brain volume, white matter tract integrity. So we showed that the change in those brain measures was the same as a function of IQ. So that even after we control for changes in brain structure, we're still seeing this impact of IQ. So over and above any changes in brain structure, IQ is providing people with better cognition. So again, when you're doing a cognitive reserve type of analysis, you really have to look at cognition relative to brain, and then in order to say here that IQ is somehow imparting a reserve that allows people to do better in the face of brain change, you have to show there's a brain change. This could simply have been a brain maintenance story where the people with higher IQ maintain their brains better and therefore show less change over time. And here, another paper under submission, we did the same analysis now looking at leisure activities. And here for reasoning, speed, memory, and even vocabulary, we showed less change or more improvement as a function of engaging in leisure activities. So that's sort of a quick review of these various concepts underlying reserve and resilience. I was convinced of the concept of cognitive reserve early on. There's these individual differences in how people process tasks, allowing some to cope better than others with brain change or pathology. And I really wanted to understand, well, how does that work? In other words, how is it neurally implemented? And it was just the beginning of functional imaging at that time. So you could say I was seduced by this new exciting field to try to use functional imaging to understand the neural implementation of cognitive reserve. And it's a little confusing because I use the term reserve in here. I said there's two neural bases for cognitive reserve, one called neural reserve and neural compensation. The neural reserve, I felt, is there's, even in young people where there's no age-related brain changes yet, there's variability in brain networks and cognitive paradigms in the healthy brain. Ideas that I thought we might be able to measure in the scanner were the efficiency of brain networks, the capacity or the flexibility of brain networks. This idea is very close to the stack idea, where over time people develop overlays of how they do tasks, and that those things might allow people to do better in the face of some age-related changes. So an individual with greater neural reserve might be more capable of coping with the disruption imposed by age-related brain changes or pathology. The key point is that these are natural differences, maybe based on exposure, how people, the classes people took, the kind of work that they do, gives them more flexibility that allows them to cope with change. And I reserve this concept of compensation, neural compensation, to when there is some kind of brain damage that forces people to try to, who want to do something, to have to use something that they normally wouldn't use. So compensation, inter-individual variability, and the ability to compensate for brain pathologies, disruption of standard networks by using brain structures or networks not normally used by individuals with intact brains. So for me, compensation is when you start to do something you normally would not do if your brain were intact. But again, neural compensation may help maintain or improve performance. And that's an important point. What we have found is that sometimes compensation allows you to maintain performance, but not as well as people who don't have the brain damage. Sort of like a cane is compensatory. It allows you to walk, but not as fast as you would. Here's the kinds of studies that I'm engaged in to try to use fMRI and imaging in general to understand cognitive reserve. We measure as much about the brain as we can, volume, cortical thickness, white matter hyperintensity burden, white matter tract integrity, amyloid and tau burden, etc. We give people a lot of cognitive tasks in and out of the scanner. And we have a lot of measures of exposures of cognitive reserve, education, IQ, leisure activities, occupation, etc. And the thought is, as I've been trying to explain to you, that given a certain amount of brain, the status of the brain is measured so carefully, it will have a specific impact on task performance, and that reserve might moderate that relationship between brain and cognition. And then we give 2 tasks in the scanner. Here we give a working memory task, and we give a executive function task, a set switching task. And our hope is that by looking at differences in task-related activation on either of these tasks, we might get hints of what I was telling you before, differential efficiency of doing these tasks, or capacity or flexibility in the solution strategy underlying these tasks that might give us an idea of the neural implementation of cognitive reserve. So people who are more efficient on these tasks might do better on that task and maybe other cognitive tasks given the same amount of the same brain status. I keep saying the amount of pathology, but the same brain status is measured here. I think the key thing that makes this different than standard functional imaging tasks looking at brain to cognition is that we're doing 2 things. We're very much keeping the status of the brain in mind, because that's very important. And we're looking at individual differences. It's not just what area of the brain is being used when someone does a working memory task, is what is the differential utilization of those areas that might impart reserve. This is a summary of many, many papers written with Jason Steffener, who worked with me for many years and now is in Ottawa. So this is a real path diagram of a sets of data using that working memory task. We have age-related changes, can in fact impact on the efficiency of the activation underlying the task. In other words, people, as the task gets harder, have to ramp it up more. And can also influence whether people can compensate or need to compensate. And all of that reflects itself, the differential efficiency and compensation reflects itself in the degree of task performance. And that those with higher measured cognitive reserve have greater efficiency, less need to compensate, and then do better. So we're putting together age-related changes, task performance, and we are looking at a moderator. Here it's IQ, but here it's differential task-related activation. What tickled me in this is that we had this other path where no matter how well people were activating, those with higher measured cognitive reserve, higher IQ, higher education, always did better on the tasks over and above everything else. So that made me think a lot about this idea of task invariant cognitive reserve networks. In other words, is there something, no matter what task you're doing, that someone with higher reserve does differently than someone with lower reserve? And I have another study, as I told you, where we're giving these 12 different tasks in the scanner, the study I referred to above, where I showed you the change over time data. So we have this study where we're giving people 12 tasks in the scanner. So this is what we thought: can we find a pattern of brain activity, and that pattern's utilization correlates with IQ and education, but that pattern is present and being used during 12 different tasks that have varying processing demands. So in other words, a task invariant network is a network that's being used in 12 different tasks, and its expression correlates with IQ or other aspects of cognitive reserve. And after we find it in those 12 tasks, and we take it to even a different task and show that it correlates, that network is there during that task, and it correlates with IQ. And then here's the key. We also want to show that once we've identified that network, its utilization moderates the relationship between structural brain measures and task performance. That's sort of the cognitive reserve test. Can we show that it allows people to do better given a certain amount, let's say, of cortical thickness? So to make a long story short, we did find this is the sets of areas, and these areas are working together in a covarying way that is expressed across 12 different tasks and whose degree of expression correlates with IQ. We call it the task invariant CR network. Expression of this network during performance of a different MRI activation task correlated with NARD IQ. And then here's the sort of the key test. Here we have a thickness pattern, a pattern of cortical thickness that correlates with fluid reasoning. And you can see in general, the thinner the brain gets, the worse the reasoning gets. But we have this nice interaction such that the people with a higher expression of this task invariant cognitive reserve network do better when the brain gets very thin. They're doing better than the people with lower expression. So it's moderating. So we feel that this might be a candidate for a network underlying cognitive reserve. And subsequently, we tried the same thing, but now using resting bold, where we want to get a connectivity pattern whose expression correlates with IQ. And then again, we want to see whether it influences the relationship between thickness, and here we just did it, where I'm just showing you global cognition. So in the derivation sample, we didn't find moderation, but we found that given a certain amount of thickness, those who could express that IQ-related connectome did better. And we found the same thing in a forward application sample. So these are sort of newer ways that we're trying to understand the neural implementation of cognitive reserve. But I would say I'm certainly a neuropsychologist by training. I try to be a cognitive psychologist. So I've always thought there's got to be tasks that we can give people that will allow us to study this flexibility of solution strategy. So I'm showing you here is the dissertation work by Daniel Beruli. It's submitted under review. And here's the idea that we had. I'm sure most of you are familiar with matrix reasoning tasks. You give people 3 lines of objects, one is missing, and the person has to use some form of logical reasoning to decide what the missing one is. I think this is the right answer here. And you can see that the approach that we would use here is a visual spatial strategy. We're paying attention to the shading and to the angle of the objects. Here's another task where, again, the person has to decide what's missing here, but the strategy here is more logico-analytic. Like, I have to notice that this plus this gets you this, and this plus this gets you this, and then do that. And there's a lot of research showing that you can really create pretty simple matrix problems that are either solidly logico-analytic or solidly visual-spatial. So very simplistically, what happens if you give people a series of tasks and they sometimes would require this strategy and sometimes that, and they have to switch between them? Could we use that as a very simplistic flexibility of solution strategy? So to do that, we created blocks of just logical analytics, just visual spatial, and then mixed blocks like here, logical, visual, logical, and the people have to switch back and forth. And then there are very standard ways of classifying how well people switch between, if you're familiar with the set switching literature. Here we use this bin score, which encompasses reaction time and accuracy and has some other psychometric qualities that are good. So the idea was that, first of all, that this bin score might correlate with IQ, and the other is that it might show us that it's reserve related. So it's certainly correlated with IQ, but here's the cool thing. Again, we have memory, reasoning, speed of processing, and global cognition. These are people who did the task. Here's their cortical thickness, and here's their bin score. So for memory, we found an interaction between bin score and cortical thickness in explaining memory. So that's a true moderation. So the bin score performance, the switching, this flexibility measure is moderating the relationship between cortical thickness and memory. For reasoning and for global cognition, we didn't find a full moderation, but we found that after controlling for cortical thickness, there was still additional variance accounted for by the bin score. So lower switch costs moderates between cortical thickness and cognition, or contributes to variance above. So this idea of flexibility of solution strategy, I think, is a very interesting one that we can measure and might give us just a different kind of insight into how cognitive reserve is implemented. Let me just quickly review some of the clinical implications of reserve. I mentioned this before. I think most of you have seen these kinds of figures that Clifford Jack has promulgated. What he's showing is that either CSF A beta or amyloid PET A beta increases over time. Then you have increases in tau. Then you have the neurodegeneration that I was talking about. And then subsequently, you start to show in green cognitive impairment. And in 2013, Cliff instituted a variation in these curves. Used to be there was just one green line. Now he shows a high risk and a low risk line in this whole area here. And what he's really doing is incorporating the effect of cognitive reserve. So for the people with lower reserve, they're going to show these deficits earlier, and the people with higher reserve show them later. So it just shows you that this effective cognitive reserve is very important in understanding how the pathological changes are converted into cognitive changes. And Cliff and I have discussed this, and he told me that's exactly what he was doing here. So the clinical implications is that if you're evaluating someone with age-related cognitive change or Alzheimer's disease, of course, you're going to measure their cognition, but it's important to get measures of pathology. When I first made this slide, this wasn't possible, but now, I mean, we could measure atrophy, but now we could measure amyloid, tau, neurodegeneration. Soon we'll have blood tests. We already have a pretty good blood test for tau. And take into account their cognitive reserve. Maybe one of these networks that we are talking about could be used, or residual measures or proxies. And really, that's the real picture. It's not just the pathology, it's not just the cognition, but the cognitive reserve is an important point of characterizing this person's status. And this type of evaluation is important for diagnosis and characterization. Prognosis, as I've told you, people with higher reserve, once they get demented, actually decline more rapidly. And then I think an important one, assessing the effects of interventions. So the standard drug trials now are not curing Alzheimer's disease. They're just trying to get less rapid change in cognition. So you can imagine if you have a bad randomization of cognitive reserve, you can have differential change on that basis and not on the basis of the presumed medication that's helping. I say, how would reserve-based interventions work? But I'm talking about interventions and just lifestyle changes. So we can think of two things. One is promoting brain maintenance that might slow aging or help us avoid pathology. And the other would be to increase cognitive reserve, which would allow us to deal better with that pathology. In that regard, I like to show this. This is a pretty old paper from 2003 with Marcus Richards, who was also my postdoc a long time ago. But Marcus is very active in the British birth cohort, where they have a lot of information about people: father's occupation, that's SES, cognition at age 8, education by 26, own occupation by 43, and then various cognitive measures. Here it's the NART word reading test at age 53. And one of the points that Marcus wanted to make is that you might say, oh, someone has a higher IQ, they get a better education, and because of that, they get a better occupation, and it's all sort of determined here. And then they'll just do better in late life. But what he was able to show is that there's a differential path from each of these life exposures to cognition, and each one is contributing differential variance. And later, when he included late life leisure activities, the influence of cognition was even less. So there's a whole bunch of important points to make. Cognitive reserve is not simply a function of higher IQ in childhood. Each exposure contributes in its own way. Cognitive reserve can be acquired at any point along the lifespan, which is, my opening to say that even later than age 53, we can think of activities or exposures that could promote it. And then a very important point, cognitive reserve is what my friend Rich Jones calls a formative construct. Cognition influences cognitive reserve differently than education and different than occupation. So if we try to create a single summary variable that summarizes all of them, let's say by using the classic latent variable factor analytic approach, we're finding what's common to these things, but we're losing what's different about them. And that's really very important. We need like a formative variable, or what I try to do is use each of these variables separately rather than summarizing. So there's a whole set of life exposures that promote reserve and probably promote brain maintenance. Here's an early paper by Nick Skarmeas, again, my colleague for a long time, now back in Greece, where he showed that the people with higher physical activity and greater adherence to Mediterranean diet had less chance of developing Alzheimer's disease than those did neither. And there's a whole host of papers regularly. There's a paper in Lancet talking about potentially modifiable risk factors. You can see education, heart healthy stuff like hypertension or obesity or alcohol, depression, social isolation, physical inactivity, etc. We're going to hear about language and bilingualism, I believe, in the next talk. So there's a very serious reason to believe that we can make recommendations about lifestyle that can help people age more successfully. Final point is just terms people use. So I've been using these three terms: brain reserve, brain maintenance, and cognitive reserve. A lot of people use all kinds of terms, and we're trying to come to some consensus on definitions. So here's one white paper that we published. This was based on these PIAs that the Alzheimer's Association has at their annual meetings. We have a reserve and resilience protective factors PIA. So 31 of us wrote this white paper trying to give consistent definitions for these three concepts. The National Institute on Aging, based on an aging conference that they had, noted that there was a lot of disparity in how people define these concepts. So they asked for what they call a collaboratory to come to consensus on research definitions for reserve and resilience. And I, with a bunch of other people, have been leading this conference. We've had 2 out of 3 of these cross-discipline work groups, workshops. And the idea is to really come up with definitions and operational definitions. So you notice that I keep stressing when I talk about cognitive reserve, I want something that somehow modifies the influence of brain on cognition. Now, you might not want to call that cognitive reserve. You can call that resilience. You can call it whatever you want. But if you have that kind of an operational definition for your concept, at least we can talk to one another. So we've had 2 meetings, 2 workshops. The 3rd workshop is going to be at the end of September. I'm sorry to put the URL here, reserveandresilience.com. But I think the real unique thing here is that we're now dealing with hundreds of investigators, with both human and non-human investigators. And I think that our recommendations will help give people a common rubric. So just to end up, I hope I've convinced you that epidemiologic and imaging evidence support this concept of cognitive reserve and the idea that it's malleable and influenced by experience at every stage of life. Here's one way to put it: 2 forms of reserve: brain reserve, which is passive but supported by brain maintenance, which really is an active process, and then cognitive reserve, which is an active process. I didn't get into it today, but the concept of cognitive reserve is applicable to a wide range of conditions. So people have used it in multiple sclerosis, and HIV, and psychiatric illnesses, any place where the brain function is impacted. We really need life course studies to study this well. And I hope I convinced you a little bit that imaging studies can help us understand the neural implementation of reserve. Accepted, consistent definitions for these concepts will be very helpful. I think the issue is not so much that someone has to call it cognitive reserve instead of resilience. I think the issue is that their studies have to be constructed in a way that really speak to resilience or maintenance if they want to be able to share results in a way that everyone else can understand. And then, of course, our hope for the future is that influencing cognitive reserve and brain maintenance may delay or reverse the effects of aging or brain pathology. And I think the evidence is there for that. I think that that's where the reason why me and many other people, I and many other people are involved in this area. So thanks so much for your attention, and I hope to see you all in person at some point.
Thank you so much, Professor Stern. Very, very grateful. I'm so pleased you mentioned the collaboratory, because that's how I first decided to write to you. You are so open and engaging and transparent and inclusive, and I really see that in your presentation today. And of course, being the pioneer in the field, we're very honored to have your thoughts. So I'm going to hand over to Teresa, who will direct some questions from the floor straight at you. And yeah, I hope you can stay with us for another few minutes.
Thank you. Before we start, I just want to mention the collaboratory. Of course, I didn't get the date right. It's the end of October, last day of October, first day of November. Reserveandresilience.com. We're going to have it live in Bethesda, but it'll also we haven't said that, but it'll also allow people to tune in from elsewhere. But what I really want to tell you is that right now, if you go to the website, we have worked out across now 70, 80, 90 investigators, and now we're asking for comments on a set of definitions and operational definitions. So if you want to read those, comment on them, and contribute to the process, reserveandresilience.com, please feel free to do so. Everyone who wants to can influence this process. Okay, sorry to interrupt you, Teresa.
Yeah, no. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. We have many questions here. I will start from my question about relating, because it's very important. You mentioned that one of the challenges is having measures for cognitive reserve, and yesterday we had a very interesting talk from Dr. Nielsen, and he talked about the challenges of cross-cultural assessments, because most of tests were developed in populations that he mentioned weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. I would like you to comment in the context of cognitive reserve, how these measures can be more inclusive in terms of different languages, cultures, and this is relevant for our conference as well.
Very much so. You know, why did we start with, for example, why did we start with education or IQ or occupation? They were just easy to measure. Education, for example, you know, any big study probably has education. So that the first point is that there's multiple exposures, and probably every type of life exposure contributes to reserve in some way. And there's probably huge cultural differences in that, depending on the nature of the society, the kind of things that are going on. And then obviously the other issue is how we measure cognition. Yes, and I think we really recognize that the work that is done in purely white English-speaking populations doesn't make it. we're sort of fortunate. The studies that I was showing you in North Manhattan are sort of multicultural studies or cross-country studies because it's a really diverse population in North Manhattan, large percentage of Spanish-speaking people, primarily from the Dominican Republic, and a large percentage of African-American. So, but yeah, I think all of that is very important. And then sort of the subtleties, I'm talking about IQ, but just different societally driven differences in exposures at young life or qualities of education, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's a very complex problem, but I think we have to recognize that. What did you call it? Weird? Yeah, I think that, yeah, it is weird. We have to recognize the deficiencies, yeah.
Thank you. I have here a question about cognitive reserve in other dementia, other neurodegenerative disease. So I work in cognitive reserve in motor neuron disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And we find that only some cognitive functions are protected by reserve. Could you comment about these studies in other types of?
Well, yeah. So I try to keep up. I end up very often if there's cognitive reserve in the paper, they might send it to me to review. So I try to keep up. Yeah, I mean, it's as I tried to say in the talk, I was, my investigations mainly focused on normal aging and Alzheimer's disease, but clearly it's applicable to any condition, and exactly how it is, quote, protective, what aspects of exposure are protective, what aspects of cognition are protected or not protected. I think that it's going to really be a very individual story depending on the condition. So ALS is a good example. There's some research on cognitive reserve in schizophrenia, et cetera, HIV-related cognitive change, et cetera. So I think it's a very broad concept, and the story is going to really vary from disease to disease, from exposure to exposure.
Okay. We have time for only one more question, but I have others that I will also send to you.
Sure.
Is the cognitive reserve model able to explain the neuroplasticity related effects result from cognitive training or physical exercise in older adults?
Right. So yeah, what we like to do, and I've done some intervention studies, but not a lot. But yeah, there are people that are really doing that. I would just point out Sylvie Belleville as an unbelievable example of someone who does that. Yes, we would like to figure out ways to improve cognition, various techniques. But I think what Sylvie does and others do, which is really so cool, is if you can do fMRI pre-post and actually try to pinpoint the types of networks that are being changed by the intervention, then we really start to get a real understanding of this change in, like I saw, the efficiency, capacity, the flexibility of a network. So I think we're getting closer to the neural implementation of cognitive reserve and understanding in a better way what our interventions are doing. And I think the other place that we're working hard in the collaboratory to get is non-human research, where they can get at brain mechanisms at a much more in-depth level than we can with fMRI, so. But it's really interesting in my conversations with the people who look at aging studies, let's say in animals, in mice or in rats or in monkeys, and to get them to try to come around to this idea that they're very often identifying some issue, like inputs to the hippocampus that results in differential performance, but to try to think about that in a reserve-related way. And I think we're making a lot of headway in that discussion, and I think that'll be very instructive as well.
Thank you so much for being here with us. I will pass now to Professor Weeks.
Thank you, Carissa, and thank you again so much, Professor Stern. I neglected to mention at the outset, but I think I'll make the point now, is the work you do on cognitive reserve. You're the pioneer in the field, but coincidentally, you are one of the world's most highly cited scientists, which illustrates the point that your concept of cognitive reserve and ergo neural maintenance has had a dramatic impact, not just in our field, but beyond, within the general field of scientific inquiry. And I think that underscores why we must focus on these issues and recommendations that you have made to us in the Greater Bay Area, particularly as we can harness the benefit of education moving forward. So once again, thank you so much for your
Thanks so much.
Your presentation.